Real Ecstasy, taken from the ALETHEON, Volume 2, page 513. The Divine Avataric Self-Revelation of His Divine Presence, Avatar Adidar Samraj. 1. When the ego prays, the practice of prayer is merely an ego-made, self-deluded, ritually dramatized, and one-sided faux performance, a monologue pretending to be a dialogue or a soliloquy, whether personal or collective, that is theatrically played to look and feel like a conversation with God. The conventional or ego-based practice of prayer is a construct or a culturally prescribed art form that emerges from the roots of social ego culture. In the exercise of ego-made prayer, ego-patterned desires, egoically limited states of knowledge and experience, and ego-bound and ego-made sufferings are made the basis for searchful utterances toward a socially prescribed and imagination-dependent God idea. When people talk with God in the conversational and merely social egoic manner of conventional prayer, they characteristically ask God for favors, as one would ask favors of a parent. Also, the God that is thus presumed to be the other from which the favors are requested is not only a mere idea and thus merely a mental projection of the ego I itself, but that God is virtually always a socially acquired concept gotten from the individual's social and cultural and thus tribal associations. All God ideas are merely and only ideas. That is to say, all God ideas are concepts or modes and states of mind. Therefore, God ideas are not other or not self at all, but rather all God ideas are intrinsically and only modes and states of self. Thus, understood, it is clear that religion is not about God as such, but all religion is about self as the center of religious concern, discourse, and practice. All religion is a prescription and a program or a seeking technique, generally intending the positive transformation or the positive development or the potential and progressive or would-be transcending of the ego I, but sometimes even egoically intending negative effects upon one another, other or thing, or condition or state, or otherwise collectivized category that is egoically presumed to be not self. When religion is interpreted objectively or relative to not self, or what is world and other rather than subjectivity, or relative to self or the ego I, religion is misapplied, even tribalized, and egoically conformed to the cult of social egoity and confined to the status of difference and to both individual and collective dissociativeness and competitiveness. All negatively intended prayer is a dramatization of the illusion of egoic separateness and separativeness, in which what is presumed and negatively interpreted as not self always subjectively persists within the ego self mind itself, and because of this, all negatively intended prayer further toxifies and isolates and threatens the praying ego I itself. Therefore, All religions should be interpreted only subjectively, or within and of the domain of the subject or the self, and, if it is applied at all, religion should be intended and applied only positively and never negatively, and entirely as a prescription and a program or seeking technique, either for the positive transformation or the positive development or the potential and progressive or would-be transcending of the ego I. An example of how this subjective or subject-based interpretation of religion would righten religious practice can be seen, for example, in such an interpretation exercised relative to Christianity. Conventional Christianity, is institutionally interpreted in the objective or not self manner. On this basis, Christian God ideas or tribal deity myths are always interpreted in the not self or other than self or outside the self manner, with God thus understood and prayed to as the other and the cause relative to everyone and everything. On that objective or not self basis, the figure or God idea or tribal deity myth of Jesus of Galilee is interpreted as wholly other or exclusively and thoroughly not self, and thus also as entirely and merely historical and abstractly concrete. However, a right or entirely subjective or of the subject's self interpretation of the figure or God idea or tribal deity myth of Jesus of Galilee understands Jesus in the domain of mind and in and of the context and psychophysical process of self, and the practice of devotion to or being a follower of Jesus of Galilee is, thereupon, made into a personally or subjectively transformative or developmental work or a life exercise of an ego-transcending kind. In that case, the idea of the crucifixion of Jesus of Galilee is understood as the mental or heart and mind basis for right life, or the disciplining of the personal life, and for the constant overcoming of all egoic or separative or merely ego-serving activity in both the psychological and the social domains. How, likewise, on that same subjective basis, the idea of the resurrection and ascension of Jesus of Galilee is understood by means of an always internalized admonition toward the esoteric practice of spiritual discipline in the mode of the ascending mysticism of the fifth stage of life. All religion arises from tribal or social egoic origins, but nevertheless, religion itself is always, at least in terms of one of its primary intentions, a program for subjective transformation or for the would-be rightening and transcending of the personal self or ego I. Therefore, if Christianity and indeed all religions were interpreted and practiced in subjective or self-based terms only, the otherwise divisive, exclusive, and fundamentalist characteristics of institutionalized and objectively concretized religious traditions would be transformed into entirely positive and always and only positively personally transformative modes of human activity. Nevertheless, all religions, even if they are interpreted and practiced in subjective or self-based terms only, are necessarily always yet limited to the ego-based sphere of prayer and seeking within the context of the first 6 stages of life. 2. Truly, the prayers, and indeed all the searches of egos, are socially ritualized or tribally prescribed and programmed performance projections of socially defined personalities. And altogether, such prayers are not conversations with God, but rather they are conversations or psychosocial dialogues the socially tribalized ego mind engages with itself. Nevertheless, those who devote themselves to such conventional prayer rituals do often experience some kinds of results in their lives, as if such prayers cause actual God effects. Why is that? Is the divine a kind of floating parent who is attracted to you if you say the right words with the right pronunciation and perform the right ritual? Is the divine waiting for the right signals? If you give the right signals, does the divine then listen in to your prayer and, especially if you are morally good, give you the result you desire? Why does conventional prayer work at all? Prayer works because reality itself is. Prayer works because reality itself, which is the egoless, indivisible, and only real God, is all in all pervading. Prayer works because reality itself is the causal source condition, or the perfectly egoless self-nature, self-condition, and self-state of all of this apparent arising of conditional world. Therefore, wherever one makes an opening in one's life that permits the all-in-all pervading and intrinsically free force of reality itself to enter into any aspect of one's existence, the God effect is immediately felt there. It is not that reality itself, or real God, is a universal parental personality who hears all one's conversational prayers. Rather, real God is the intrinsically egoless, indivisible, acausal, and self-evidently divine self-nature, self-condition, and self-state of reality itself, and therefore the all and all pervading and self-evidently divine spiritual presence of reality itself, and the universally pervasive natural energy of cosmically evident reality itself are always immediately available to rightly oriented human psychophysical participation. Whenever conventional or ego-based prayer functions to whatever degree as a psychophysical self-opening, and thus as a potentially effective intention to direct available energy to specific aspects of personal existence, then the universally pervasive natural energy and, as the case may be, the all and all pervading divine spiritual reality presence will flow into those areas of existence to the degree and with the potency that is made possible by the causative force of one's prayer intention and the quality of one's felt participation in the process. Thus, conventional or ego-based and personally strategic prayer will tend to produce results if such prayer is offered with a degree of real force and integrity of psychophysical participation. Indeed, this cause and effect principle is always intrinsically the case, even though, as in the case of conventional prayer, the actual process whereby results are produced is not understood by one who engages in conventional prayer. However, the results of conventional prayer do not occur for the reasons that the one praying imagines they occur, but rather conventional prayer is a ritually enacted and ego-based substitute for what would otherwise be intrinsically ego-transcending understanding of God, and direct engagement in the cause and effect process of tacit or wordless and mind-free psychophysical participation in the cosmically evident reality principle of the world. The results of conventional prayer occur because of the reality principle of the universe, inherent psychophysical participation of all and all in conditionally manifested existence, and therefore the results of conventional prayer do not occur because the divine is the kind of separate, superior being proposed by conventional religious ego thinking. 3. Conventional prayer is an exercise in substitution magic, wherein a God idea is proposed as substitute for the ego I, whose own mind projects the God idea as a magical other from which favors are to be requested. Whenever any individual enters into the practice of conventional prayer as a simultaneous bodily, emotional, mental and psychic enactment of intention, the substitution technique makes an opening for the universally pervasive natural energy and, as the case may be, the all-in-all pervading divine spiritual reality presence to infill and influence whatever is the focus of one's attention. All accomplished practitioners of esoteric yogic and spiritual techniques understand and experientially prove the principle of opening the body-mind complex to the universally pervasive natural and spiritual energy of the cosmic domain. Having enacted a psychophysical opening toward the universally pervasive natural and spiritual energy, esoteric practitioners use the powers of the mind to direct that energy. Once the body-mind complex of the esoteric practitioner is opened to the universally pervasive natural and spiritual energy, that energy tends to produce effects according to the esoteric practitioner's intention, even if no substitution magic or ritualized employment of God ideas or tribal deity myths is introduced into the process. The body-mind complex is itself the only necessary technique for participation in the cosmic processes of cause and effect. How one participates in the process determines the kind of results or all the possible experiences, all the forms of possible knowledge, and all the apparent powers to control future nature and destiny that are potentially generated by means of esoteric yogic and spiritual techniques, and otherwise by means of conventional or exoteric prayer techniques, or even by means of any otherwise applied means of science, magic, or esoteric mysticism. 4. Whether by religion or science or magic or esoteric mystical techniques, it is possible for human beings to produce negative effects as well as positive effects on naturally patterned events. In any case, the effects apparently generated by the cause and effect manipulation of universally pervasive natural energy are determined by one's state of mind and body and by one's conditionally patterned characteristics altogether. Therefore, it is not intrinsically egoless, indivisible, and a causal reality itself, or real God, that is causing the results of prayer, or otherwise of religious, scientific, magical, or however esoteric mystical practices, but rather It is always the technique of applying the body-mind complex to intend pattern changes in the universal cosmic field of causes and effects that is causing the results. Indeed, in the common or ego-based exercises of religion, science, magic, and mystical esotericism, it is egoity, or the separate and separative ego I, that seeks and makes all the results of cause and effect, effort done by human beings. 5. Religion is the psychophysical search toward reunion. Religion is the psychophysical search toward the goal of either reunion with the divine, projected as a God idea, or a tribal deity myth, or reunion, or otherwise conditional union, with particular conditions, states, others, or things. The word religion is traditionally understood to mean binding or joining again. Religion is always pre-rooted or self-contraction, or ego-I, the space-time bound point of view, still located in bodily or total psychophysical identity. Religion is a product and a characteristic orientation of egoity at root and of social and tribal ego culture in practice. Religion is always ego-based and search-oriented. Religion is intrinsically bound to the root self-contraction for separation in identity and the body-mind complex, and thus, and thereby, religion is intrinsically and always oriented toward the search to solve the problem or the inevitable dilemma result of egoic self-contraction. Egoic self-contraction is separation and difference and bondage to psychophysical and thus temporal and spatial and self-locatedness, or chronic dissociation from the context and the fundamental equanimity of intrinsic or always prior unity with all and with and in reality itself. Religion is the intrinsically absurd search to achieve the otherwise intrinsic egolessness and the always intrinsic prior unity with that is a characteristic self-evidence of reality itself, but which is seemingly forgotten and actively denied by means of egoic self-contraction into psychophysical and temporarily and spatially located and separated point of view, or ego-I. Therefore, the emergence of God ideas and prayer techniques is a characteristic of social ego culture, like all other methods of problem solving and search bound and psychophysically engineered human effort, including service, magic and mystical esotericism. Right and true human culture can only be based in the self-evidence of reality itself, which is intrinsically egoless, problem-free, searchless and goal-free, and right and true human culture always already demonstrates the psychophysical evidence of fundamental equanimity and of the tacit self-apprehension or self-apperception of the essential differencelessness or intrinsic and always prior unity of all that arises conditionally, including all that arises as the conditionally apparent experience of life and world. The only by me revealed and given radical or always at the root reality with Adidam or Adidam Vishiradam is intrinsically and uniquely non-religious, and always priorly free of the presumptions and the searches or the seeking techniques of the goals of ego culture, whether in the mode of religion or scientific or magic or mystical experiences. Therefore, the only by realizing given radical or always at the root reality of Adidam or Adidam Vishiradam is intrinsically and characteristically free of both the objective and the subjective modes of the interpretation of religion. The only by me revealed and given radical or always at the root reality of Adidam or Adidam Vishiradam is intrinsically and characteristically free of both the objective and the subjective, and altogether first 6 stages of life, modes of the interpretation of life altogether. Therefore, the only by me revealed and given radical or always at the root reality way of Adidam or Adidam Vishiradam is intrinsically and characteristically free of all God ideas, all tribal deity myths, and all techniques and methods, including prayer techniques and prayer methods of psychophysical self-manipulation, now toward the goal of reunion with the divine, and our reunion with any condition, state, other, or nothing at all. Six, thought and bodily or even total psychophysical action is not right and true method or reality true means by which to enable and establish right and true change. Thought and bodily or even total psychophysical action or strategic method or seeking technique cannot cause or achieve the realization of reality or real God itself. However, if change is required or would be, and if thought and action arise in and as and entirely on the basis of the always prior or intrinsic and ultimately transcendental spiritual process of reality or real God itself, then thought and action are the immediate evidential wisdom and truth demonstration of real God realization and of the perfect coincidence of the total psychophysical or whole bodily pattern of living awareness with the egoless, indivisible, causal and self-evidently divine context that is reality itself. The right and true understanding of thought and action is the root understanding of thought and action as the wisdom, the truth demonstration, and the potential work of reality or real God realization itself. Therefore, if change is required or would be, do not ask for changes and then wait for the changes to happen as a result. Always already intrinsically be as changed, and thus and thereby always priorly and actively be and categorically presume the would-be changes as being in fact the case, and on that basis always and only or merely observe and do not seek or merely intend and look for the experiential evidence. This is how reality itself works. This is how real God, which is only reality itself, is. 7. True prayer is characteristically egoless, problem-free, searchless, and free of the need to exercise psychophysical methods and techniques in order to achieve the goal of reunion or of equanimity or of differencelessness or of prior and necessarily intrinsic unity with the divine, which is only reality itself, or of experiential coincidence with any conditionally apparent experience, state, other, or thing at all. True prayer is intrinsically and thoroughly without God ideas and tribal or social egoic deity myths. True prayer is not a search toward union or reunion with the divine. True prayer is the life demonstration of prior and intrinsic psychophysical equanimity, always priorly and intrinsically free of egoic self-contraction and search-mindedness, and of the always prior and intrinsic self-apprehension of self-apperception, of the intrinsically egoless, indivisible, and a causal self-nature, self-condition, and self-state of reality itself, which is self-evidently divine, and which is the one and only real God. True prayer is intrinsically egoless and tacit or mind-free, concept-free, and non-strategic or searchless, whole-bodily, or total psychophysical divine communion, and intrinsic or perfectly and always priorly body-mind transcending reality realization. True prayer is uniquely and altogether a principal characteristic of life demonstrated practice in the only by me revealed and given radical or always at the roots reality way of Adidam or Adidam Ishiradam. 8. In the only by me revealed and given radical or always at the root reality way of Adidam or Adidam Ishiradam, true prayer is engaged as a whole bodily participatory or total psychophysical conscious process of real ecstasy or egoless transcendental spiritual divine communion. In that practice of true prayer, my devotee responsively exercises the body-mind complex in a me-recognizing devotional process of tacit direct participation in the intrinsically egoless, indivisible, a causal, and self-evidently divine self-nature, self-condition, and self-state of reality itself. Thus, in the only by me revealed and given radical, or always at the root reality with Adidam, or Adidam Vishiradam, true prayer is the intrinsically ego-transcending practice of real ecstasy, whole bodily demonstrated as devotional communion with me as I am. When my true devotee practices true prayer, he or she potentially and only secondarily, and perhaps even indirectly or unintentionally, also causes positive changes at the level of conditional or psychophysical knowledge and experience. But the orientation of the practice is, in any case, always through ecstatic participation in the egoless, indivisible, and the causal self-nature, self-condition, and self-state of self-evidently divine reality itself. Through the intrinsic and always prior transcending of egoity, in whole bodily recognition responsive devotional communion with me as I am. Therefore, in that practice of true prayer, the body-mind complex, which is otherwise both the technique and the goal of converted prayer, mystical esotericism, is itself transcended, and only the divine self-nature, self-condition, and self-state of reality itself intrinsically is thereupon, and tacitly and searchlessly, beloved, realized. 9. If you are my true and rightly practicing devotee, the life that you might otherwise have presumed to have been created or caused and chosen by the God you had in mind, has ceased to be a pattern with which you egoically self-identify. Thus, in the practice process of the right and true devotional and in due course transcendental spiritual relationship to me, your conditionally manifested life has always already ceased to be effective as an egoically self-limiting process, and at last your conditionally manifested apparent life is utterly outshined or transcendently spiritually dissolved and vanished in most perfect divine self-realization. 10. In the only by me revealed and given radical or always at the root reality of Adidam or Adidam Vishiradam, the by me given process of true prayer depends on the maturing of my devotee to the point that he or she is always enacting the universal law of self-sacrifice, or of the intrinsic surrender, forgetting, and transcending of the separate state and the separative activity that is egoity or ego I itself. In that case, the life demonstration of whole bodily recognition responsive devotion to me is not like that of a child depending on his or her parent, but rather the life demonstration of my true and rightly practicing devotee rightly, truly, and fully demonstrates searchless, whole bodily, or total psychophysical, and always already body-mind transcending participation in the intrinsically egoless, indivisible, and a causal self-nature, self-condition, and self-state of self-evidently divine reality itself. 11. It is characteristically presumed by every ego I that this conditionally arising world is not itself and as a whole being caused by oneself. Characteristically, the ego I presumes that it did not produce this universe through a personal act of conscious mind. Then how does the universe arise? Clearly, the universe is arising through a process and a power that is greater than the egoic personal capability to think and suggest and intend changes. Therefore, the ego I is intrinsically and obviously dependent on that great process and power. Whatever that process and power is, and however that process and power may ultimately be described, you are dependent on that. The human context of intrinsic and thoroughly dependency on the process and the power that is greater than the ego I itself is a factuality that cannot be sanely doubted or disputed. Obviously, all of this conditionally apparent arising depends on a great process and power that is senior to the point of view and the limited functions of the human individual, or even of the collective totality of all human beings. Therefore, the individual, each and all, must awaken to that intrinsic acknowledgement and consent that always subordinates the ego I, or the otherwise presumed to be separate and separatively active body-mind self, to that process and power, even though the ego I itself cannot know or define and limit what that great process and power is. The great process and power is intrinsically mysterious to the ego I. Therefore, the individual, each and all, must grow on the basis of the awakening of intrinsically self-subordinating acknowledgement and consent into profound and intrinsically ego-transcending or ecstatic whole bodily participation in the intrinsically or always at the root self-evidently egoless, indivisible, a causal and divine self-nature, self-condition, and self-state of reality itself. 12. Reality itself is altogether and divinely present here. Reality itself is altogether and divinely present, non-separately, non-differently, and egolessly, as here and as perfectly prior to here. Reality itself, or real God, pervades and transcends all space and time. Real God is the self-existing, self-radiant, intrinsically egoless, indivisible, a causal, transcendental, spiritual, and self-evidently divine self-nature, self-condition, source condition, and self-state of all and all of conditionally manifested existence. Real God is the context, the environment, and the root substance of all and all of conditionally manifested experience, manifested existence. Real God is the context, the environment, and the root substance in and as which you are aware of conditionally manifested existence itself. All the conditions of knowledge and experience that arise for you are conditionally evident and, as such, merely apparent or non-necessary, only temporary and non-ultimate modifications of the divine self-nature, self-condition, and self-state of reality itself. And those conditions are themselves constantly conformed to your psychophysically evident point of view, or space-time location, your conditionally patterned and presently effective psychophysical disposition, or the characteristic or otherwise present-time effective state of the body-mind complex, and, as the case may be, the technique of prayer or of religion or of science or of magic, or perhaps of applied mystical esotericism, to which the body-mind complex is, whether consciously or unconsciously, presently devoted. Through whole-bodily responsive devotional recognition of me, as I divinely avatarically appear in bodily human divine form, and through critical self-inspection based on listening to my reality teaching, and in due course through whole bodily recognition responsive devotional awakening to my transcendental spiritual and self-evidently divine self-nature, self-condition, and self-state of divinely avatarically self-transmitted presence, the body-mind complex of my devotee is, by my causally self-transmitted divine avataric blessing grace, converted at root and altogether reoriented and transformed into a moment-to-moment conscious process and a transcendental spiritual conductivity process of intrinsically ego-transcending whole bodily recognition responsive devotional communion with me as I am. Thus, and as such, the real ecstasy of egoless, whole bodily, transcendental spiritual divine communion and perfect self-emancipation is the characteristic and at last final demonstration of true prayer in the only by me revealed and given radical or always at the root reality way of Adidam or Adidam Ishiradam. Da, da, da.